Worsborough Reservoir in Barnsley in South Yorkshire. It's a famous fishery and home to some of the world's best anglers. Alan Scotthorne cut his teeth here. Denis White taught them all how to fish here. Tommy Pickering, Dick Clegg, Keith Hobson. Too many names to mention, the home of the Barnsley Blacks. I've not fished here for a long time because obviously our fishing scenes has changed, and but I know that over recent years the venue's completely changed in the fact that it's had the introduction of carp, but the silverfish population has always been amazing and still is strong, and if you know, I'm honest, I believe it's as strong as it's ever been. And we've come here today, I've not been for years, and we're just going to fish away and try and remember what's so good about this fantastic venue. So Worsborough is a natural venue in the sense of it's traditionally a roach, bream, skimmers, silvers type of venue, and as I mentioned, obviously it's had an influx of carp quite a number of years ago actually, which has enhanced the venue because it's attracted sort of specimen anglers and also added a little bit of an extra dynamic to the fishing here. But you know, traditionally it was always skimmers and bream, and then sometimes you catch roach and hybrids, and there's been some immense weights, but it was just good fishing. And you'll obviously see the lake behind me, and it's a dam, and it's an old mill, you know, it served a mill that's obviously long gone, and therefore naturally it's deep at the one end, at the dam end, shallow, what they call the shallows, and there's around 60 pegs on the venue. And today we're on peg 39, which is just off Kipling's Wall on the Barnsley bank. Sheffield Bank's on the opposite side, and this is sort of like a third of the way up from the dam wall, which will give us the opportunity to get into an amount of depth. It's sort of cooling down as the year's progressing. Obviously we're in autumn, and I just wanted to make sure that we were fishing in sort of deep enough water to catch everything. So we've got a chance here of catching all the species. So I'm just going to approach the day with an out-and-out feeder approach, because this is a place where I learnt quite a lot of tricks for feeder fishing from the great people that I mentioned earlier. A real schooling this place was for me and for lots of other people. Hopefully we'll catch skimmers and bream, that's the hope. Maybe we'll catch ourselves a carp, and maybe we'll catch ourselves a few hybrids. But simple approach. I'm just going to fish away because I've not been here for years, and therefore I'm not going to say I know exactly how to fish it. So I'm probably going to fish it like a little bit blind really, about 30 metres with an open-ended feeder, worms and casters. I've brought a few dead maggots, a few worms, a few casters, a few live maggots. I have brought some other stuff in case we need to have a look for a carp and things like that, but I'm hoping to just have a nice, lovely fishing day, catching some of the resident silvers, and show you what a great venue this place is. Now, before I go any further, we obviously put some cracking effort in, and we come out here fishing to provide you with some fantastic footage to create these great videos. And we're not asked for a lot in return, apart from that you obviously give some great comments and you keep watching them. But I'm just going to ask one little favour, which is if you would like, and more importantly, subscribe to our Nufish channel, which would help us a massive amount. It's a small effort from you, but a great reward for us. And that, in return, I promise to keep doing these videos and make sure that the content gets better and better so that you get the entertainment you're looking for. So just subscribe for us. It's not a lot, but it means a lot to us. Well, to kick the peg off, I'm going to kick it off by introducing a little bit of bait, a little bit more than I'm expecting to be fishing with, and that's just so that I can, when I do start fishing, as in when I put the feeder on that I want to fish with, I know that I'm sat over a little bit of bait, and I'm not talking a lot. I'm just going to put 3 feeder fulls in, and these are sort of like a medium-sized feeder, just a cage, and I'm just introducing a little bit of worm and a few casters because I'm fishing for those roach, bream, skimmers, odd hybrids, just let that settle good at bottom before just gently shaking it out, because when I do put me, I've not actually put the hook on yet, but when I put the hook on and I put my fishing feeder on, I want to be able to sit patiently and read the swim. And so by introducing a little bit of bait at the start, that lets me know that, sort of reassures me that I'm sat over some bait and I can find out what's happening. If I'm trying to introduce bait and fish at the same time, that doesn't always allow you to read your swim properly. So I'm not baiting up, boshing it, you know, filling it in, setting it up for a big bream arrival like I would say at Ferry Meadows. I'm just kind of kick-starting the peg, as I said, so kicking it off. So 3 of these feeder fulls. This is a 5 square cage, and that allows the bait to be released really quickly. Cracking feeders, easy to cast, and I'm just measuring in what I'm putting in, and we'll take it from there. But a nice, simple way of starting. Making sure you hit your clip also gives you a little feel for where you're fishing, and it's interesting when I'm putting bait in at the start, I'm always mindful that you do this, and a lot of people, it hits the bottom, they strike the rod. For me, that spreads your bait a little bit too far, and more importantly, it spreads it towards you, and you can create yourself an issue with line bites when you're doing things like that. So just let it at the bottom and just try and gently shake it out. And the advantage of either having a braided line or our low stretch line is that you can feel your feeder and just take up the tension, then just give it a little rattle and try and empty the bait out, and that just keeps your bait concentrated, which I'm convinced will catch you more fish because you're fishing in a tighter spot. So just think about that when you're baiting up. So after a bit of a slow start, I've actually got me little counter and clicker on here. I've had 8 casts, and I've been kind of impatient, 3 to 5 minute casts, and with no bites. And there's a few anglers around on the res today, and it looks like it's just a slow start. Now, it's actually been a cold evening, it's quite cold, I've had to put my hoodie on. But the sun was out early and made it kind of feel warm, but I've got a funny feeling that the autumn nip is in the air and it's kind of put the fish down a little bit. But we've just had an indication, which looked a bit like a liner. And then the last chuck I've had a roach of about 3 or 4 ounces, which is it's great. There's an odd fish being caught on a pole quite short, so that's interesting because that's the shallow water. Where I'm casting is I've got a count of about 3 seconds on a 1 ounce bomb, which in my opinion is somewhere between 7.5 to 8 foot, that sort of depth. That's at around 30 metres. Might be a little bit further, might be 35. I've not measured it today. I just thought I'd fish away and cast into an area where I think most people are comfortable casting. Nice 11-foot rod, made life nice and easy. And yeah, we've had an indication, and I've just had that roach, so maybe the fish are starting to wake up. I had actually introduced a little bit more worm into me bait. That was a bite that I missed, because I felt like we're trying to make something happen. Patience is great, but sometimes you have to stimulate fish into feeding. What I have done is put a small piece of worm on my hook, because the first bite that I thought I should have hit, that I didn't, I had sort of 3/4 of a small worm on, and I thought maybe it's too big a bait, because I'm feeding chopped worms, and I'm a big believer in sort of matching the hatch. So if I'm feeding chopped worms, then I like to fish the same bait on the hook. If you were feeding casters, you'd fish a caster on the hook. Feeding maggots, you'd fish a maggot on the hook. So yes, it's all worms, but sometimes put on the hook what you're feeding through the feeder, and that's given me a bite, and that roach, and then that was just a bite. So I'm just going to keep thumbing a bit of worming, a bit of chopped worming, because I think that's obviously stimulating the fish, and it's an interesting point. We did a great worm video recently, which were all about fishing on a skimmer and bream water, but the one fish that really responds to worms is roach. And a lot of times with feeder fishing and pole fishing, if you want to draw roach into your peg, a great way is to introduce finely chopped worms. Don't ask me, why that is, but they seem to home in on it. But it is a bait you've got to be careful of, because it can pull in all the small fish, and sometimes you can't catch them bigger fish because your peg's too busy. But worms is a great bait this time of year. I think, as I mentioned in that previous worm video that we did, the autumn, when the fish are thinking about putting weight on for winter, it's a really high protein bait, and the fish sort of want to gorge on them to prepare themselves for the winter period. So let's see how that progresses. So it's great to be back here at Worsborough, and I don't really know why I've not fished here much in recent years. I think the match scene kind of changed, and I mean, how long will it be? 1991, when I joined the famous Barnsley Blacks, and to be honest with you, I'd not really fished Worsborough much before that. I'm from Rotherham, and we always kind of went the Trent, as did obviously a lot of the people that came here, but I think this is a good local water that people fished locally. But it were kind of a bit of a mecca, and when I joined Barnsley, I realised that Worsborough had its own sort of like circuit. I remember some amazing matches here, UK Championships. They were always around here. It were back then when it were originally McPherson's Paints and the Yukon UK Angling Championships and various sponsors, and Steve Toon ran it, and I was fortunate to get a place on that. Alan Scotthorne got me in on that, and that were a great experience, and rubbing shoulders with all sorts of different people, Pete Clapperton, Bob Nudd, Kim Milson. I always remember all those anglers fished it, and it were kind of the pinnacle of match fishing, because it were a real mixture. They were around on the Trent, Gloucester Canal, it might be Earlswood Lakes, Worsborough Res. They'd kind of mix it up a little bit, but Worsborough were a kind of a fixture point on that. Gold Valley were also in the later years when I fished it, and back beginning of the 90s, it'd be 91 when I first came here. They'd have a round on here, and you'd come on a Wednesday night match, and there'd be half of the England team and people from Essex and like Clapping, Glenn Brown, and as I said, Kim Milson. I remember him sitting behind Alan Scotthorne, because he was the man on here, and it was the first time I really seen people fishing shallow, because of course we talk about shallow fishing all the time now with carp, but Alan had shallow fishing, or up in air as he called it. As I call them, I've got them up in air. And if you're not familiar with Barnsley slang, then that means in the shallow water on a deep peg, fishing in the top 3 foot, and he had it absolutely spot on, and fished it really, it were unconventional really, because he used to feed a lot of brown crumb, but he wet it down into like a milky, soft slop, and he'd throw that. Alan's a massive bloke, and he can flick a walnut or groundbait 30 metres, and it don't even look like he's tried. And he used to loose feed 3 and 4 pints of squats, and oddly fish a caster on the hook, and he had it absolutely spot on and mastered it, and that were a real eye-opener for me. And I remember him and Bob Nudd having a real head-to-head in the UK. I think that was the UK Champs the year before I'd ever fished it, and they do on the Dam Head. There's an odd picture kicking about where they were both bagging, and I think they both had £50, and my memory's not that good, but I can't remember who finished out in front, but it were within ounces, and that were close to the record back then. But the thing about Worsborough was that even though it weren't a £100 venue, because it was bream and skimmers, not, you know, £30 was quite common. We're here on, this was natural bank back then. These fantastic platforms that had been put in weren't even here, so you'd sit in water, and just here in front of Musselbed, as they called it, they'd catch lots of roach. £30 weren't an issue on casters and groundbait, and at varying times of year, depending on when you came, the shallows could be quite good, and they'd be full of fish. I remember Simon Roth coming in, winning the Keith Hobson match, fishing with an 8-foot tail and floating maggots with dry groundbait, and he absolutely paralysed it on a day where conventional didn't really work. And yeah, it's a real great day to come back and think about all those times. Walking down from the van, we've come in at the back entrance at Wigfield Farm. We went past where the little sort of inlet is, the bay, and you've got the disabled pegs to the right, and then these boats to the left, and that reminded me the first time I ever saw Worsborough was a national police competition. That must have been back, I'm going to say sometime around 1987, when God were a lad. And we'd basically, the police used to run a brilliant junior competition around the country where local constabularies would run a junior match, and then the winners of that would come through into a county final. So I think I fished with the Doncaster police because I picked my entry form up from a shop in Denby, and we fished at Own Pier Point. Mark Price were there, Mark Borden were there, loads of anglers who still fish today. And then we came, I think I finished second to Mark Price in the two-legger, and we came here to represent Doncaster as a team in the county champs, where there'd be Barnsley Constabulary, Sheffield, there might have been two from Sheffield, Rotherham and Doncaster, of course, and the top, I think it was 8 or 10 in the match, then went through to represent South Yorkshire, and I was lucky enough to come third in that with £8 odd, and we'd be using sort of 10-foot fiberglass rods, fishing with brown crumb, only worms as an upbait. We didn't have nobody fished chop worms then, and you'd put squats and pinkies through. Dead maggots weren't even a thing. And I first met Sean Stenton there, a lad that I fished with last week down at Tamar. He lives down there these days, and Wayne Bartholomew were in that competition as well. So fantastic memories, and we went through then to the grand final to represent South Yorkshire, which we won as a team. So really put a smile on my face today, and whether we catch anything or not, it's an absolute pleasure to be back here at this iconic venue. What a proper bite that one. That's why, it's still on. So it would appear that there's a few small roach feeding, or is this a perch maybe? That's a perch. Sharp jag. I've just slipped a maggot on because I can see that the pole anglers are catching small fish up to my right, and that's interesting. I went out with one maggot and came back with two. A typical perch, obviously picking up all the bait, so we'll just try another one of them, but it's a slow start. I'm still putting a few worms in because that certainly seems to be creating an odd indication. But an interesting thing is that what's occurring to me is, even though it's only sort of 8 foot deep where I'm fishing, I've noticed that I actually know the chap. I've not seen him for a long time either. That brought back a few memories. A local lad called Carey Welford, smashing fella and a great fisherman. He's caught a few fish on just a top kit. Now obviously where he'll be fishing that will be really shallow, and then he's catching a few fish on a long pole, like sort of 11, 12 metres maybe. So I'm actually wondering if the fish are all in shallow water, Now he's only catching roach, but if that's what's feeding today and the skimmers and the bream aren't feeding, because maybe they're out in deeper water, who knows, then I'm just wondering if we need to think about setting up a shorter line in shallower water, you know, probably a little 10-foot rod and just fishing really close and getting a few bites that way. I'm actually went to swing that because I thought that was a really small roach, and even though it's not a net buster, I mean, look at that, that's beautiful, that, isn't it? That's got to be a good 8 ounces. It was too big to lift, I can assure you. And that were on a maggot as well. Stunning fish. And maybe it's the roach that are feeding today, so that one responded straight away to a maggot. Maybe it might be worth just putting a few more casters through and maybe dropping an odd maggot into the feeder, encouraging them, because if we caught those every chuck in, I'm convinced that we'd attract a few more along with them, and maybe even some bigger and better fish as we build a swim, because I'm a strong believer in that, you know, even though we all like to catch big fish, I think sometimes it's important to keep putting fish in your net, because what it does is it forces you to work, forces you to recast, and therefore introduce bait to your swim and build your peg. Well, that maggot's certainly been a good change of bait, because that's a couple of fish in a couple of chucks on that, and that's another roach, look. Great sport. I just put a few casters and maggots through my feeder that time, so I'll keep doing that. But I definitely got a response off them worms earlier, but maybe it's not really what they want, and it's worth experimenting. And usually when you're fishing any kind of method, it doesn't take long to establish what works and doesn't work, especially when you've got fish in your peg. That's the time to make changes. If you're trying to learn a venue, or you know, it's your first time at a venue, or you're looking to practice a method, when you're catching fish, it's a great opportunity to have trial and error, because when you're not getting bites, you can't really determine and define which change has made the difference. Sometimes the time of day, you know, you might spend all day fishing worms, for instance, and then right at the end you change to corn, but that's probably just because the fish have rocked up. But when you're getting lots of bites, making quick changes, you know, putting in worms, taking worms out, bigger feeder, smaller feeder, change of hook bait, it's a great way to learn how to fish a venue. Because if you're getting a bite of chuck and then you do something that stops it, it's definitive. And don't be complacent, because ultimately learning what works and what doesn't work builds your sort of library of knowledge and methods and tricks that allow you to catch fish, not just on the venue they're fishing, but on other venues as well. And obviously we're not fully au fait with Worsborough, because we've not been for years, and I just know that it's teeming with fish. I've seen some of the match weights, some of the pole weights are amazing. Somebody had 80 odd pound of silverfish. Now that looked like a line. I was a bit impatient there because that tightened up. Lovely. And yeah, somebody had 80 odd pound on a pole, not far to my right. Well, I'm presuming he were up here because I could see the boards in the picture, bream and skimmers and roach and hybrid. So there's a massive opportunity on a place like this to catch fish, but we just need to understand what they want and how they want it, really. So we'll keep persevering and see how it progresses. So obviously we've had a roach or two and getting a few bites, and I was just thinking to myself about the ground bait, which I need to top my little bowl up actually, and how things have changed, because today I'm using Sonu F1 green and F1 dark. I've mixed sort of 75% F1 green and added 25% F1 dark to it just to darken off the mix, which of course is a fish meal style ground bait, not a particularly strong one. The F1 ranges are quite weak, but what a contrast that is to what we would have used. I mentioned earlier, you know, Alan Scotthorne just feeding brown crumb, and it's sort of normal for us to fish meal these days, and I did consider it when I was packing my gear to come, that, you know, would I be as well off fishing cereal mix? And when I say cereal mix, I mean, you know, a natural style ground bait based on bread and biscuit, that sort of ground bait. There's lots of different ones out there, but like the Sonu natural range, for instance, great ground baits. But what I thought was that places like this get fish with pellets a hell of a lot these days, and even the fish that are more, you know, naturally attracted to bread type ground baits or cereal type based ground baits, they see a lot of pellets. So by using this very weak fish meal ground bait, I thought I'd get the best of both worlds. And it's interesting that you catch roach on it. And when we first started using fish meal ground baits, I think we thought that they were the kiss of death, but there's still a time and a place for both, without a doubt. But it would appear to me that, you know, fishing for a mixed net of fish, and I'm talking about skimmers and bream, then I'd always want to err on the side of a fish meal ground bait. That were a little indication then, almost like a liner, just a gentle tightening the tip and a flick back, which is almost like on a fish's back, rather than a bite, which is more of a rattle. But just keep my eye on that. And skimmers and bream love it. They love fish meal and they love pellets, and the more a venue sees pellets and fish meal ground bait, the more effective it seems to be. But there's still a place for sweet, we call them sweet ground baits, but it's basically cereal ground bait. Not to be confused, because there's sweet fish meal, and then you'll hear anglers off the match circuit saying sweet ground bait. What they mean by that is cereal ground baits, not to be confused with sweet fish meals. And obviously in a lot of the videos that we do, I talk about a strong fish meal mix, which is my go-to one, is the Sonu 50/50 green, which is really a real strong fish meal ground bait, and I've used that ordinarily to define the type of fish that I'm catching. So if I want to catch skimmers, bream, bigger fish, I'll go for a stronger mix. To catch more of a variety of fish or smaller fish, skimmers, roach and that type of thing, I'll always err on a weaker type of mix. And you know, now and again on a natural venue, for instance a canal, you know, or a venue that doesn't see pellets, then it's always worthwhile looking at a cereal mix. I mean, we talk about continental ground baits as well, don't we? Because of course when we all use bread, we had white bread and brown bread, and basically you add proportions of that depending on how much you wanted it to bind. So brown crumb doesn't bind that well, and we'd add white crumb to make a binder. And then along came Van den Einde, I think was the first, my memory. I've got some old memories of Census, which was Z72, an interesting ground bait. It came in red or yellow, and inside that were a bottle of liquid, sweet smelling, pungent, but almost like the juice that you put on top of your ice cream type of stuff, and that were a real contrast to everything else. But I'm sure it was cereal based, as I remember back. It were bready but bright red and bright yellow, and that were effective for some people back then. And then when I first started coming to here, a popular ground bait that Alan and some of the Barnsley lads used were Mine Footer and also Secret, and then another ground bait called World Champion, and basically they were quite binding ground baits, Van der Nine, so cereal based, but for deeper water where you couldn't quite get your bread to bind, and white crumb would overkill, those ground baits. But it's amazing looking back how things have progressed and changed, because you know, I know there's still people who use brown crumb on certain venues, but it's almost a forgotten bait, and how many people will be chucking bread over those railings at the ducks, God only knows. And bread's an effective bait, and if you throw a loaf of bread off there, the carp that live over by the stanchions will be mopping it up. So it does make me wonder, and I have to question myself, maybe I should have brought breadcrumb, but we'll go with his favourite, and we'll see how that works for us. But it's interesting looking back how things change, and I'm sure it's for the better. But always remember not to get lost in the moment and think about your fishing. Now that's interesting, because that's the first skimmer. Now I'd had a couple of indications and a couple of missed bites. That's a lovely fish, that. And I don't know if you can see that, but oh, it's come off. Right, I've been fishing a piece of worm, sort of a nice section, same sort of size I'm feeding, but I missed the previous bite, and I just nipped a very small piece in half. So I'm fishing with a tiny piece, and I mean a tiny piece. And that's gone straight around with a skimmer, which is interesting, because I've had an odd indication. And is it the fact that the way that they're feeding, they just want a smaller bait? Who knows, but we'll try that again. That's a small fish after that skimmer, and a few indications, which were probably the same fish in the bite we're developing, but just a roach. But of course, now I've had that skimmer, I'm hoping to catch another one. But I'm just going to try a little red worm, because they can be absolutely devastating, and I've got these left over from a recent competition, and they can be absolutely devastating for skimmers, but not always ideal to use when there's lots of roach there, because they're a delicate bait and get damaged quite easily. Just going to put two small red worms on and see if that can tempt us another skimmer. I've kind of cut back a little bit on the amount of free offerings, because I think there's a few fish in the peg now, and I'm not sure. A few indications that I've had whether they're actually line bites off skimmers or whether they're just poor bites off roach. But well, that certainly, I wound that fish off. I think that was just a roach, but that were an immediate response from them red worms. Maybe I need to just put a smaller piece on, or I just put two on then to try and, as I said, tempt a skimmer. But sometimes one works, or half of one is really good, or two small pieces. I just put one on, break it in half, and hook the second half. But if you're going to use that sort of bait, it might be, you might need to scale up the hook size, because that's not particularly a big 16. And I'm just wondering whether I need a bit more hook for that kind of bait, but let's see what happens. Not jump to conclusions just yet, because it might be it's not the right bait at all, and we might have to revert back to that tiny piece of dendrobium head, which, as I mentioned earlier, is what we're feeding. That's the sort of what we're putting through as feeder. So if that's what they're coming to, then it might be the right bait on the hook. Another sharp jab. And the fish are quite aggressive, and you're getting liners. A method feeder, or that type of feeder can be quite effective, because the fish are coming to the bait rather than picking up the hook. But that certainly looked like a small fish bite. Now, if I were trying to catch small fish, or if I'd come to catch small fish, I'd probably have fished a little bit closer, because it's not always easy fishing sort of that sort of distance. For smaller fish. But let's keep soldiering on, because this is an interesting scenario. When you do pleasure fish, or doing what we're doing today, and you're only fishing one line, you've got to kind of make that work. Now, obviously, if I were in a match scenario, and let's say it were a feeder only competition, I'd probably have two lines, and I'd probably have a really short line, because I know the pull is very effective here at Worsborough. And if the fish want to be short, or you're only catching small fish, then, as I mentioned earlier, a nice 10-foot short cast, a 10-foot rod, and making a short cast, and you can catch lots of small fish. But as I said, I'm hoping to catch a mixture of fish, and I feel that a lot of the time skimmers want to hang back a little bit further off. They're not always keen to come so close in. Cracking roach. That's on a real small piece of a big red worm. I'm just searching through for another big red worm, and I actually caught two fish on the same piece then, and it were chomped to hell. But it sometimes I find that that's really effective for hooking fish, because it's softer where it's been previously damaged by a fish. And when you're catching large numbers of fish on a feeder, and worm hook bait is really good, I find that a soft flattened piece is more effective than a sort of hard fresh piece. But you can artificially do that by just crushing it with your fingers, and I think it's just the way that the fish take it in the mouth that just allows them to swallow it a bit better, and you hook more bites. So don't always be worried if your bait looks a bit chevelled, a bit chomped. Especially not when it's a piece of worm. The fish will have it. In fact, sometimes it's more effective. So it's not like a maggot, and I don't know what the difference is really, but a busted maggot's hard to catch another fish on, but a chewed piece of worm seems to be equally as effective as a non-chewed. That's when you're fishing a small segment. If you're fishing a big worm, then often it's the movement of the worm that is the attraction, and obviously if it's been chewed, it's not going to really move much. I'm actually going to net this roach because it's too big to swing, but I mean, they are cracking fish. Probably not really great feeder fish, but if you were catching them with a pole, you'd be really happy. But we'll keep taking them and hope that we can feed a few skimmers and bream into the swim, which is, now I'm getting a few roach. I'm actually going to up the feed, so I'm going to keep pushing through worm and caster, because my brain's sort of saying if I'm getting bites off roach, which, you know, I've just had 3 and 3 casts as quick as you can, that they must be eating the bait that I'm putting in. Well, if that's the case, then that means they'll be clearing out everything I'm putting in. So I'm going to up the feed and see where that takes us. So I'm packing that feeder full and see if we can increase the size of the fish. So we've been fishing for a couple of hours now, and even though the roach spot's quite good and it's interesting in the fact that it's been quite tricky to catch them, and that's probably to do with the fact that you don't really want to be fishing for roach at 30 odd metres on a feeder, but I'm just thinking that I've had one skimmer, lovely fish, and I'm thinking that I need to probably up the bait, because there's enough mouths there with all these roach indications and bites I'm getting, that they must be mopping up all the loose feed that I'm putting in, which isn't going to leave much bait to attract bigger fish, and especially roach and skimmers and bream. So I think it's a cracking day's fishing, don't get me wrong, because the fish are fantastic, beautiful, pristine as well, really good condition. And I think if I were catching them on a pole, I'd be over the moon with them, and you'd probably catch more of them on a pole. However, we've come to fish with a feeder, so we're going to try and change it up a little bit. And I mean, I'll push some bait through this cage feeder that I've got on. I mean, that were a lovely slow pull, and I might have been a bit impatient there, because that might have been a liner or something. But when you're catching roach, obviously you can pick up on small indications, and you need to be quite on top of your tip, if you like, because that's the way to hit more bites. But I don't like striking at sharp jabs, because ordinarily they're not on. But when it's a steady pull like that, sometimes that's just a good quality roach giving you a bite. But it's not like bream fishing, where you can sit on your hands and wait for the rod to be dragged in. You sometimes have to be more active. And you'll see I'm obviously putting my rod in a rear rest as well. I've just got a mushroom butt rest on, and that just helps me to take my hand away from the rod, so I'm not snatching at bites. But if I was roach fishing and I was trying to catch quick and probably at a shorter distance, I would actually hold my rod on my knee, because sometimes just a little movement and the fish are on, and you have to be quite reactive. But an interesting thing that Tommy Pickering told me was, if you're getting skimmer bites and you need to be patient and not striking too often, is just put your rod in a rest, and that'll slow you down. And that means that you're not going to be striking at liners, bumping fish, disturbing the fish, and you're going to get your catch rate's going to go up. So a butt rest is more than just a lazy product that helps you to drink your cup of tea or whatever it is that you do when you're waiting for a bite. It can just temper your fishing and make sure that you're not too active, because of course every time you strike at a liner and you've filled your feeder, you're putting more bait in, which sometimes can add to the chaos. So it helps to just slow everything up. And look at that for a cracking roach, and that's responded to obviously the increase in bait that I've been pushing through that window feeder. And I'm sure that there's a lot of these out there, but they are tricky to catch, but so rewarding. I mean, that's a real good fish. That's getting up there for 10 ounces. And although the skimmers are eluding us, these roach are providing cracking sport. And I'm sure that on a pole they'd be even better, but if you're just coming to somewhere like this for a day's feeder fishing, what's not to love about that? Worm hook baits, worm and caster through the feeder, great bites, quite intriguing, and what I call interesting sport. So we're going to carry on with our session. Thanks for watching, thanks for tuning in. I hope you've had a lovely insight into this great venue that's got a lot of history, and we'll probably come back another day and try and catch some of the carp maybe that live in here. But for now, I hope you've enjoyed your introduction to Worsborough Reservoir, and thanks for joining us. And don't forget to like and subscribe to all our videos. There's some great content that I'm sure you'll learn something from. See you soon.